I think that every person in some way or another creates a story that makes sense of their lives. They might not call it mythology, and they might call it their biography, or they might call it, their religious belief, or they might cast it in, my philosophical point of view is, or, but I think that this is a part of the human condition. We learn, yes, we learn from experience, but there's some very telling things. It's not what we experience that impresses us so much as the stories about what we experience. And, I mean, you can have the experience, but the experience doesn't really live for you the same way till you tell somebody about it. I'll give you an example of an experiment that was done that really talks about this. They took this group of 3-year-olds in this preschool class, and they divided them in half. And half of the kids they took to the zoo, and the other half of the kids had just a normal day. And in the course of the normal day, the others were at the zoo. They brought them all back together. Then the next day, and for the next several days, they divided the class again in half. They took half of the kids who'd been to the zoo and half of the kids who'd not been to the zoo, and they sat them down and they talked to them, and they said, hey, you remember that when that alligator, came and you were scared, and you remember that monkey swinging from the tree? And they went through this whole narrative. And the other half of the class, half of whom had been to the zoo and half of whom they never talked about it again. And about 7 months later, they said, write a paper about going to the zoo, or they asked the kids to tell a story about going to the zoo. And lo and behold, the half of the kids who had been told about going to the zoo, half of whom had actually gone and half of whom hadn't, all believed they'd gone to the zoo and all talked about it. The half of the kids who'd been to the zoo and they'd never talked about it and they'd never been told about it, they didn't even remember going to the zoo. They didn't even have a record of it. Okay? So it's not the experience we have. It's after the experience when we try to explain it to somebody, which is explain it to ourselves. So it's in the narrative that we create that the meaning comes. The experience is an experience. It's the story. It's the narrative that gives it the meaning. So that's the mythology that gives it the meaning. So you might not call it mythology, but in fact, that's what people are doing all the time when they try to transfer inexplicable experience principally into a communicable story that makes it mean something to them. Otherwise, it's just a inexplicable experience until it's digested. It's like a burr in your saddle. It's a pea in your bed. It's something caught in your throat. You can't shake it. You can't get rid of it, but you can't give it meaning. It'll drive you crazy. I mean, the human being is hardwired for narrative. I mean, we have a need to make sense of our experience by creating narrative. That's how we do it. We either do it by that or we do it through pattern recognition, and most of our pattern recognition are what a statistician would call a type 1 error. I mean, we see a pattern where there isn't one. I mean, astrology is a great example of that. Numerology is another one, and I could go on. But there are all these, but again, it's a sim thing. It's looking for a pattern that explains otherwise inexplicable things. The pattern doesn't work. At a certain point, even the pattern, the pattern is not communicable until it's narrative. If you say, oh, he's such a Pisces, that happened because he was a Pisces, well, that's pattern recognition. Supposedly you're looking at that, but if Pisces doesn't mean anything to you, that means nothing. But if you say, oh, well, the Pisces, that's like the fish, and it's really watery, it moves through the watery realm, and this guy's sort of wishy-washy all over the place, and so it's just clear to me that he's a Pisces, because I got it. The narrative makes sense of the pattern.